Hedge Funds in Focus, Unlocking Market Liquidity and Institutional Innovation in Mexico. Cuando escuchamos hedge funds, pensamos en sofisticación, en estrategia, en leyenda. Pensamos en George Soros, en Ray Dalio, en el long short que lo cambió todo. Pero también pensamos, ¿y en México? ¿Dónde están nuestros hedge funds? Hoy esta pregunta llega a su momento clave. En esta mesa redonda se reúnen arquitectos del cambio financiero, figuras globales y locales que han vivido la evolución de los mercados, que han construido fondos desde cero y que entienden el verdadero poder de este tipo de vehículos. Hablan de regulación, sí, pero también de visión institucional, de cultura, de profundidad y de talento. La nueva regulación abre la puerta, pero la industria no se construye con leyes, se construye con estructura, convicción y profesionalismo. Y México, por primera vez, tiene la oportunidad de hacerlo bien. Hablaremos de cómo los hedge funds pueden dar liquidez, sofisticación y eficiencia a los mercados. De cómo las afores, las aseguradoras y los family offices pueden ser impulsores estratégicos. Y de algo vital, el talento. Porque sin gestores formados, sin experiencia real, no hay industria. No basta con querer ser hedge fund manager, hay que ganárselo. Este panel es una hoja de ruta, una provocación y es también una invitación, porque si México quiere dejar de estar en la periferia financiera y pasar al centro, este es el camino. Y la historia empieza hoy con la presencia de Carlos Kreshner, Quant Trader, Lucy Pambukjan, Expert Latam Capital Markets, Mauricio Basila, Founding Partner de Basila Abogados, Silvia David, Markets and FinTech Professional, y para moderar la mesa, Laura Herrera, Chief Financial Officer de CAIA y CEO de la firma Capital. Les damos la bienvenida al Risk Management and Trading Conference 2025.
We wanted to start speaking first from the U.S. perspective because of their experience. So we had Silvia here, which is an expert in the asset class. So the first question I wanted to ask you is, which kind of ecosystem you need for the hedge fund industry to flourish?
So thank you so much for having us. And yes, my career and background has been in capital markets for over 20 years. Across all aspects of the spectrum and seeing a lot of products launch and go to market. From a hedge fund perspective, one of the most important things is obviously the stage that Mexico is in right now, which is assessing the entire regulatory landscape, viewing what regulatory gaps exist. So that's step number one. I think another critical component is really to speak to experts, to sit down and speak to the stakeholders across the entire industry, all the investment professionals, advisors, and more importantly, to sit down with experts from other markets, from the United States, from Brazil, from other markets that have a robust and successful hedge fund industry. So that's incredibly important at this stage. The third component is really from an investor protection standpoint, what is Mexico going to do and offer to these investors once this hedge fund industry is live? There's a lot of resources. For instance, is Riskmafics going to be a resource? Will there be other industry associations? The key is to ensure when you go live that there's enough resources and investor protections in place. And I think lastly, of course, and is related to the investor protection piece, is the educational piece. In the United States, unfortunately, historically, hedge funds have been misunderstood and, they are complex. And the industry in the United States, when it first took off, was viewed as almost secretive. So I think it's a lesson learned. It's an important part of an ecosystem in order to flourish, to make sure that there's a part of investor education that launches in advance and right before the industry really takes off here in Mexico.
So, for example, for Mexico, which we are kind of in the first step.
First inning.
First inning, and have the experience, which would be your focus for due diligence for your first investment on a hedge fund?
The first due diligence?
Yes.
So from a due diligence standpoint, research is critical. I think investors first should ask themselves, what's the investment strategy? What's the strategy of the hedge fund itself, right? And really, that's really taking a look at, well, is it going to be a macro fund, an event-driven fund, right? There's different quant funds, right? So first it's important to look at the strategy of the individual fund, right? The other component when you're doing your due diligence is also operational. And it's incredibly important for investors to take a look at various different levels within the operation. First thing that I always look at is who's the leadership team, who's managing the hedge fund. What are their bios? What type of service providers are they partnered with? Do they have an independent auditor? Right? What type of technology infrastructure do they have in place? Like, who are those service providers? For instance, do they have cybersecurity in place, right? Is there a business continuity plan, right? So the operational piece has a lot of different components, and I think it's really up to the investor himself and herself to do this due diligence on all of the operational pieces. Another important part of that is how open has the hedge fund been in making information available? Again, that's an issue and a challenge that I highlighted earlier within the United States, that, in many cases, there was a lot of, there wasn't much information available, right? And so that opaqueness is not something that you want when you're investing and looking at, to invest in a hedge fund, right? So I would say these are all very important, critical parts of the process. And doing your research to see if there was any red flags, going on online, seeing if there was any challenges. So it's important to really, go through the steps, taking a look at, like I said, the strategy of the hedge fund itself, even if there's risk management and, controls in place for that hedge fund. But on the other hand, operationally, check all the boxes from the technology platform to, are they working with independent regulators? Have they filed, right? In the U.S., it's with the SEC. What else? What other regulatory filings? What else is available? Right? So it's a very comprehensive approach, and I would say you need to be proactive when you're investing. If you're looking to allocate your capital in instruments like hedge funds that do promise high returns on investment, you also need to keep up with doing your research and your homework and kind of relying on the resources that are out there.
And based on the U.S. experience, would you say that we should focus more on the product itself or the market education? Because sometimes the hedge fund is really working well, but you didn't understand which kind of risks you were taking.
That's an excellent question, because I've seen this play out in many different scenarios. And one of the things I will say is you should do both, right? To answer your question, you could have a phenomenal, high performing hedge fund, but it won't take into account the market conditions, right? So, unfortunately, they're not protected from the market conditions. So something like the housing crisis that happened in 2008, right? Of course, it impacted also the hedge fund industry. And in fact, in the early 2000s, and I was at a trading firm called Instinet, one of the first electronic broker dealers. Some of you may be familiar with it. And I remember at that time, there was a lot of discussion about all of these family offices started to invest in hedge funds. And it was also pension funds, right? Everybody thought this is high performance, going to yield good return on investment. And then, when market conditions started to occur, 9/11, being one, unfortunately, that really impacted and closed down the market. Then again, I mentioned the housing crisis. More recently, in more recent years, the meme stocks or like GameStop and of course, the pandemic, right? All of these components have impacted even high-performing hedge funds, right? So you could do all of your homework, but you also have to take into account what are the current market conditions, and is this the right vehicle to invest in currently, depending where we are, and to safeguard yourself from it too. Like, just because you did the research initially doesn't mean that you shouldn't evaluate whether that's the right hedge fund for you down the line based on the strategy in which they invest.
Okay, thank you. I wanted to move on into Brazil. You know, it has been one of the most developed markets for hedge funds. It has a huge asset management industry. So, which hedge funds have been the most successful in Brazil? Which kind of strategy?
Thank you for your question. I think I need to just give you the background information on how hedge funds reached to the point they are because we had our own problems in the past, right? In 2000, you might remember in 2000, 1999, 2000, Brazil had its own crisis, currency crisis. And due to that situation and further developments that happened in Brazil, at some point in 2002, the regulators, the central bank, called all the funds in Brazil to market the assets and the value of the funds. And then all the problems came out because everybody was just putting their prices or their performance. All the funds were putting their performance out. But when market came, the problem was addressed that most funds were not covering the correct asset prices at that time, and hedge funds have not, or the funds had not respected the hedge limits that were in place at the time, that were kind of divided. The regulation was divided between the Securities Commission and the central bank, depending on the asset that was underlying in the portfolios. So ever since, the regulators have changed the approach. Now it's the Securities Commission that regulates all asset managers, regardless if it's equities or fixed income or other derivatives or other assets. And since then, we have created a regulation that tackles into the regulation of the asset manager, and it enables the creation of different types of funds, including hedge funds, which in Brazil are called multi-mercados or multi-market funds. And then even an equity fund can have its hedge operations inside it when it's a multi-mercado, respecting limits, leverage, the levels that every fund should have in terms of controls and due diligence and all the things. So going beyond this background information and going specifically to your question, the big houses that we have, the big asset managers that we have in Brazil have done a great job. I can mention some names, of course, the names of the banks that have their own asset managers, the big banks that we know in Latin America, Itaú, Bradesco, BTG Pactual, maybe Santander, and some local government banks too. But importantly, some independent asset managers that have been some of the leaders in the region. So Vinci Capital, for instance, which is also present in other countries in Latin America, have been doing a great job. Point is, nowadays, over the last maybe 3 years, with interest rates so high in Brazil, when we talk about hedge funds, we're talking about mostly, or multi-mercados, we're talking about mostly investments in credit, private credit, or fixed income, because those are more targeted to the interest rates that we have in Brazil, not on equities, and a lot of hedge on FX too. So those are the big trends that we are seeing. Of course, as you said, the volumes are very important. The asset under management surpasses 3 trillion reais, which should be about $1 trillion US. So it's a very important number or figure. But another important thing that I would like to address in terms of what happened in Brazil and how we developed this all in Brazil, it's of course the regulator, but the self-regulation that we have in Brazil for asset managers. There is a very strong national association of investment banks and institutional investors or funds in Brazil, asset managers, and they are very strict on the rules that help the funds or the asset managers to follow regulation and best practices in self-regulation, but also to address the capacities of the professionals that are setting up the portfolios and have them doing the CFA and other types of certifications that are required in Brazil. So, of course, the story always teaches us. We had a big problem in 2002, but lessons learned enabled us to create a much better framework, which nowadays led to $1 trillion asset management.
Now that you said market pricing, I was thinking about this perception that hedge funds are like black boxes. Do you have to disclosure your positions on a weekly, monthly basis, or how does that work?
On a monthly basis, that is Ambima. This is the Association of Funds in Brazil, and to the regulators. Of course, the regulators, in this case, is the central, the CVM, which is the SEC in Brazil. They also do all the auditing and all the verification of information. They go specifically on the assets as well to ensure they're doing the mark-to-market and adequate allocation among the types of funds that they are set up. So, yeah, but they obviously don't release the information to the public in general, specifically how much they have in each stock and everything, because this is, I would say, confidential information, or there's expertise, so they don't want to teach it to anybody. And one thing I would like maybe to mention that is happening nowadays in Brazil, we are seeing, because of this bad momentum for equities in general, we are seeing some important funds merging, at least 2 or 3 sometimes, asset managers merging to create a new momentum, because we have over 1,000 asset managers in Brazil. It's a huge industry. At least 15,000 funds in Brazil. But, the performance has been very damaged over the last period. So we are seeing some types of mergers and acquisitions in some cases. Important names on asset management are merging with each other just to make sure that they are getting stronger and not weak in this period of no new raisings. Everybody is very concerned about putting money on funds or equities. So investors which are very educated, going to the point that Sylvia brought here. I think we've been talking about this over the last few days. In Brazil, financial education has been transformational for the size that the market has today. And of course, investors, the more educated they are, the more conscious they will be about the investments that they are doing. So they are in a moment of preferring fixed income rather than hedge or other equities investments.
Yes, I guess in Brazil happens the same as in Mexico, where you have a high local rate. So comparisons between the local market, the private markets, and also getting on this new fee scheme, which I think it's also important for hedge funds, right?
Yeah, right.
Perfect. Maybe we can switch to Carlos, which has been also involved in the hedge fund industry in Brazil and knows a lot of how that market works. But you have a huge experience here in Mexico. Which things would you say that it would be good to take from the Brazilian side, or which ones do you think should be more local for Mexico? Which things do you think you have to tropicalize, how we call it in Mexico?
Thank you, Laura. That's a great question. Let me start with a shocking statement. We have had hedge funds in Mexico for the last 25 years. Now, these hedge funds are not regulated. I had the benefit of dealing with Arminio Fraga when he was at Soros, and with Rob Citron when he was at Tiger in the early 90s, so we're living in New York. And essentially, we're at that stage. It's a stage where the hedge fund is not registered locally, is not under any kind of supervision. It's an offshore fund, but it does invest in Mexican assets. Most of the money comes from Mexican investors. The case of Brazil, same as in the US, is a case where the unregulated industry, which was offshore, somehow became regulated. And that is the huge obstacle or a huge a problem when you try to regulate an onshore, to call it some way, the unregulated offshore funds. And I think Brazil did a great job. My understanding, but please correct me if I'm wrong. They started with the offshore industry, and then somehow they came to a point where you could invest without having to go offshore through a local shell, which would invest in the offshore fund. And there was some level of disclosure, but it was still a very open investment regime. You could almost do anything anywhere in the world within some minimal constraints. And as you start to move onshore, it starts to become, in many instances, a local hedge fund, which by definition, if you're limited or restricted to a local market, is not a true hedge fund. Or you may end up having a lot of restrictions, which again, that deviates from the original concept of a hedge fund. Similarly, in the US, up until 2009, it was a totally unregulated gray industry, mostly retirement funds wouldn't touch hedge funds, mostly was family offices and so on. And then when they started regulating, they required some level of disclosure. They cannot still be sold to retail unless, there are always examples of successful hedge funds that may access retail in the US and Brazil. There is probably a better story around that. So that is, to me, the biggest the biggest issue in Mexico. No, Mauricio, when he explains how the regulation is working, we have had Mexican investment advisors with offshore hedge funds funded with Mexican money that deal maybe 40-50% of their dealings in Mexico and 50% in the international markets. And maybe one day it's 20% because Mexico looks risky, or maybe one day Mexico is 70% because it's better than going to Europe or elsewhere. So, but we have hedge funds in Mexico by definition. So to me, that is the biggest hurdle in Mexico, to make sure that the regulation doesn't end up being a regulation for, let's call it, a more flexible mutual funds, where you can probably do multi-assets and engage in some sort of derivatives risk, which today is almost prohibited to the Mexican funds when they go to retail. So it's very important how regulated they will be if they're allowed to be sold to retail, in which markets they're going to be able to trade, and that is still being discussed. And who can buy them? At the end of the day, if it's only institutional and qualified, and there is a huge hurdle that you need to be worth at least 10 billion Mexican pesos with a track record of at least 5 years, then that is going to end up being something very strange. The idea is to start maybe with the way the US did in 2009 or Brazil did at the beginning of the century, starting with the international hedge funds and seeing how they can be somehow incorporated locally. For me, that would be a good option.
And you think locally, I don't know, I would like a long-short equity fund in Mexico because there are some calls that would like to be taken. And do you think you could have appetite for that kind of fund in Mexican hedge fund? Or you still think that it would be a regulation towards having offshore funds listed in Mexico?
That's a good question. It will be very difficult to have offshore funds listed in Mexico because by definition, if they do a lot of offshore, Mexican regulation is very similar to the US and Brazil. Local funds, regulators prefer that invest in local markets. Mm-hmm. So my concern is that we end up having something that is neither international nor local. At the end of the day, it's a risk balance between what investors you let in, what investors have to stay out. For me, the Brazilian model, and please correct me if I'm wrong, I'm not an expert like you, is a very good one. They already have a huge hedge fund industry outside of Brazil, and somehow ours is not as big. I know 3 or 4 cases of success, but ours is much smaller. But in Brazil, they sort of played very well with a combination of local and offshore, and they were able to put them together in a very efficient way. Now, there are some funds, I'm pretty sure, hedge funds that are only locals, you probably have a lot of non-local hedge funds that are domiciled away from Brazil, but finding a way of combining that, I think Brazil is a super successful story.
Do you think that in Mexico we are prepared to have local hedge funds in terms of infrastructure, manager education? There has been a lot made for Afores,
Yes.
but I don't know if the funds industry, do you think you have the perception that we are ready?
We have a very strong network of service providers that are required. We now have very strong independent custodians that can connect very well with international custodians. We have skilled valuations, independent. So I think everything is well set up. But again, it will depend a lot on what the regulators say, because if it's very complex, then nobody's going to want to be onshore anyway. I think, even if you have the infrastructure, why stay onshore if I'm going to be limited to local markets and very strict regulations? So it's complex. But I agree with you. With the Afores and other asset management players, we have enough infrastructure, even connected globally, to make this happen.
Okay. Maybe now that we have been talking about, obviously, the need for regulation, maybe Mauricio, I know you're an expert. Which is the next step? What do you what kind of rules do we need from the Commission?
Right. We were discussing with Carlos before starting the panel that we were in a similar roundtable 15 years ago with Rismatics, and we were talking about how hedge funds were taboo in Mexico. And that was because the regulation prohibited mutual funds to investing in hedge funds. And that came from long-term capital management, other cases. So it was a very stigmatized product in Mexico at the time. And even though that in 2001, the prohibition was lifted, no one knew how to market a hedge fund or if it was really allowed, because here in Mexico, we're very accustomed to wait and see if the regulator or the regulation allows for something. If it's not regulated, no one wants to touch it. So we saw this problem, and in 2019, we proposed a regulation through the industry association, which became the law now that allows the hedge funds. And I think it's a good step, because finally this taboo is broken, and now the law says you can invest in hedge funds, even though, like Carlos saying, they've been around for more than 20 years, but of course always are the vehicles are offshore, the manager probably is onshore, the clients as well. So all the pieces were scattered around the globe. So now regulations saying you can invest. So in Mexico, even the institutional investors are very self-regulated and regulated by the authorities, and they want to fit in some box because they don't want to take any risks. So now I think the challenge is that the regulator has to issue secondary regulation to specifically set out what will be the disclosure requirements for hedge funds and for the managers, even though they're not regulated in Mexico. A hedge fund manager can operate freely without any kind of registration for a private hedge fund. But now, in the mutual funds law, which specifically provides that investors can invest in hedge funds, although they're only available for institutional or qualified investors, it specifically says that investment advisors or companies that manage mutual funds operating companies, they can set up hedge funds for their clients, which I think is a huge advancement because any client in Mexico, regardless if it's retail, if it's sophisticated, qualified, institutional, all of them in Mexico want to have custody in a central depository system with an intermediary, with a bank, and they want to have a bank statement or an institution statement that reflects investment in a security that has an ISIN number that is registered, has all the numbers necessary to prove that they have a security, regardless the underlying investment. So I think the law is able to provide for that with confidence for investors. I think that's a huge step. Now, what happens is we have seen that the Bolsa has been flat for over 10 years. So that doesn't make it's not attractive. Like Carlos was saying, most of the times, people, regulators, investors, they want to invest in the country where the hedge fund is set. So it's not really attractive, the Mexican market right now, because we're just listing companies. The companies are listed. They're flat in the prices for such a long time. So I think there are several factors here playing, but I think the instrument is available. I think that's what is important. And what is also important is it's not restricted to invest only in Mexico. You can invest all over, and it's a matter to see what the commission is going to do with the secondary regulation about the assets. But my view is that they're going to allow all kind of assets. So I think it's a matter of weeks maybe because they're already made. They had to issue this secondary regulation by the end of last year. So they're already late now. I think the industry association needs to push the commission to issue this regulation. But I think it's going to be a good opportunity for especially for investment advisors, independent investment advisors, because I think they're the ones that have the knowledge, the client base, and they would know how to manage these funds. So I think the opportunity is there, and we will see what the commission is planning to do.
I have a lot of questions of all the things you said, which I think are really important. You were talking about the broad assets that the commission could enter in these kind of structures. From my point of view, the SIC has a lot of opportunities for investors like myself, but a lot of the clients have already custody their assets outside of Mexico, and they already use offshore hedge funds. But I think the opportunity is for the institutional investors here in Mexico.
Right.
And do you think regulation is going to allow all of these assets listed on the SIC, which are sovereigns, to be included in this type of hedge fund strategy?
Definitely, because all of the SIC listed securities are recognized as listed securities in the stock exchange, and all the SIC securities are recognized as registered securities for Mexican regulatory purposes, because Mexican regulation acknowledges the registration made in countries member of IOSCO, and Mexico, US, Japan, Europe, all of them are members of IOSCO. So any securities from those countries are acknowledged in Mexico as registered securities because all of them comply with the same degree of disclosure of information. So yes, definitely that will be within the scope of securities.
That's
Or
that's right. And you've worked on Amex Cap, and there has been a lot of work made for the Afores to have the alternatives as a relevant asset class. Do you envision that kind of growth for the other institutional investors in Mexico? Do you see appetite?
Yeah, I mean that's an excellent point. Um, if you see the development of the investments of institutional investors in Mexico, it's really surprising how poor it is. You can see a lot of sub-sovereign funds, local state treasuries, local state pension funds. They do invest in repos,
Mhm.
28 days repos, managed by the bank that provide the service of trustee, and they don't have any sophistication whatsoever. So I think uh, they're starting to invest through these asset classes. Amazingly, they started with private equity. They will start with secondaries, with pre-IPOs, with private credit. So I think the answer is yes. Uh, the potential is there. They're realizing now how much they're losing because they have long-term obligations. They have to fit them with long-term investments rather than invest in money markets. So they're seeing the responsibility to pay out the pensions, and of course they need to have a portfolio that matches those obligations. So I think they're moving in that direction very slowly. I think the industry needs to educate them because that is also important. And this kind of instruments, I think, help with that. And yes, I mean, they started with private equity, but they have to move on across the spectrum of alternative assets, including hedge funds. And I think the Afores, the Mexican pension funds, will be investing in hedge funds as well. I mean, if they see a good strategy, a good track record, a good management,
Mhm.
I mean, why not? I mean, I think they will do it.
And I think the last question of regulation, which is so important. Do you think that it's going to be available for investors in Mexico to have active ETFs or funds, offshore funds listed at the SIC anytime soon, or there is no one working on that?
Great question. I have to say, because I was a former regulator at the CNBV, that the current regulation that dates from more than 25 years ago, when they allowed the global securities through the SIC
Uh-huh.
to be recognized, there was this concern that they could not allow mutual funds to be listed in the SIC because it was considered a threat to the local fund industry. And they said, you can list whatever you want, but funds, mutual funds, because you will destroy this industry. But I think nowadays that is completely outdated. I think if you're a Mexican investor, want to invest in US, Europe, you have a lot of instruments available right now through ETFs, etc. Or also, if you want to invest in other strategies, it's pretty easy to open an account in the US, even in Europe. So it's not complicated for qualified investors to do so. So I think they need to change that now.
Mhm.
They need to change it because you need to to open the market. And I think that's one of the problems of the Mexican market, and that is one of the reasons why the Mexican market doesn't grow, because most investors that are qualified or accredited investors under U.S. standards, they invest outside of Mexico. Any client that has above $1 million, they have an account offshore. And not because they don't like Mexico, but they don't find the opportunities to invest here wherever they want. If you provide all the spectrum of instruments, investments, that you can make it from Mexico, then I think you would have a lot of accounts coming back to Mexico, because you're investing through a solid, large financial institution. You don't have the concern. You don't have the concern of local risk. You can do it from here. So that, I think that is one of the reasons why also the Mexican Bolsa is so small, because no one is interested in having two accounts and the small account for investing in Mexican Bolsa and another account to invest in the US, and it's complicated. So I think the best strategy is to open up, say, look, you can list here whatever you want. The investor will decide anyways. You cannot force an investor to invest in Mexico because it's not available in Mexico. You will go outside to invest wherever you want. So it's better to open up the regime, say, you can list in the SIC wherever you want. And local industry needs to compete with that. And of course, local industry will specialize in Mexico. They will always be better in their own securities, like private equity, like anything else. For instance, if you're an institutional investor that wants to invest in private equity in Mexico, in Mexican companies, you're going to invest with a Mexican manager. Because you know that Blackstone or General Atlantic, they don't know anything about Mexican companies. So if you want to have exposure to Mexico, you're going to select a Mexican manager. Same with the stocks. So I think that's a mindset that they need to change now and say, look, we need to lift all these restrictions, allow the products so the client feels free, and see if really the ones that want to go outside of Mexico, they're already gone.
Yeah.
So you want to bring them back.
And besides the competition between onshore and offshore, do you think, maybe, I don't know if it is for Sylvia or Lucy, do you think that there is also a huge competition for hedge funds between ETFs and these alternatives which are less liquid? And what is your perception? Or the hedge fund has a market on itself? Is it?
I mean, I'll speak from a U.S. perspective. ETFs, exchange traded funds, have always been deemed and viewed safer, right? So, I think they're two different markets. I think for hedge funds in general, you really need to do your homework. You need to check their performance. There's been a lot of change in the U.S., as was alluded to earlier in the past couple of years. So now, given that there is, regulatory oversight and that there is a perception change, because in the United States, there was a media and a PR issue with hedge funds. And now there's finally a shift. Some of the hedge funds are starting to get out there more, because after the banking crisis, and I was at NASDAQ managing all, these challenges with perception, hedge funds were deemed, Wall Street greed, whereas ETFs were always known as safe, return on investment. So it was a perception issue, right? It's gotten a lot better in the United States. And I think they're now viewed as two different vehicles. And I think it's gotten better because of the more willingness of these hedge funds to get out there in broader platforms and to do the educating, right? And the key component in the US is now Folks know that there are different types of investors, right? Whereas, ETFs probably safer for your individual investor. Hedge funds, are probably more popular with accredited investors, family offices. And again, ultimately, you need to do your homework for both. But I think personally in the U.S. in particular, they're two different types of instruments. And I think you as an investor need to know what's better for your strategy.
Perfect. I think we're running out of time. I don't know if you want to open for questions.
And I think Lucy wanted to provide the
Brazil
perspective.
Yeah, to go to the point, I think, yes, in Brazil, each of the funds, each of the structures have its own audience for that. And one thing is because hedge funds are not available for any retail investor. It's just for qualified investors, which is the point that Carlos brought. While ETF, which is kind of a new instrument in Brazil, we started listing ETFs, a Brazilian ETF in 2004, but we spent 10 plus years with almost no liquidity on that. And nowadays we have other types of ETFs, even international QQQ and other ETFs that are international, based on international indices, available for retail, which again, going to Sylvia's point, yes, it's more maybe transparent and more suited to retail because they can follow the evolution of the performance index that those ETFs are following. So we actually encourage people normally to start trading with ETFs, buying or investing in ETFs, because this is a basket, it's transparent, there are portfolio managers taking care of everything, while in hedge funds or other types of multi-market funds, it's on the discretion of the asset manager itself. So yes, I think both have their own public.
I also would like to add, essentially, originally when ETFs were launched, this was 30 years ago, they had to be indexed. As Mauricio was saying, if you want to bring an ETF from the US, it has to be indexed according to Mexican SIG regulation. Nonetheless, the US has diverted from that dramatically. I don't know if it's for good or for bad, but now there is active ETFs. 10 years ago, you didn't have active ETFs. And there is even a higher level of that, which is dark ETFs, where essentially it could be a hedge fund. It could be a hedge fund as long as it complies to certain US domestic definitions, blah, blah, blah. It's not really an international, all investments free vehicle, but it's already a dark ETF. So, I mean, everything is so complex. It's crossing the lines. That's what makes it really very, very interesting, and that's what allows
the diversification, right? That's Mauricio's point. We have to enable diversification. So each investor decides what they want to do with it.
Let me just say add to that there's a small loophole in the SIC. Because like Carlos saying, when this restriction to these only ETFs, when they put it in place, they didn't think of active ETFs. So regulations just talk about an ETF with an index.
With an index, true.
Yes. So if you're able to develop an index that has this active component on it, you design it, you can list it on the SIC. The challenge is to create the index to achieve.
Well, and I will say that, back in 2007, when I was at NASDAQ at the time, we partnered with the Mexican Bolsa de Valores, and we launched, an index fund, and we promoted it at the Bolsa, and it was really to start to create that awareness locally here in Mexico on that index ETF. And then we did the same thing in 2008 in Brazil, and we launched it at BMF. So it was, I think the point is that, partnering with some of these index products, looking for ways to broaden opportunities for investors. That's something that we did in that time period when I was at NASDAQ, to really continue to grow the reach of the Qs, which is, one of the most popular ETFs.
And the great advantage to list something in the SIC is you have a 10% tax on income tax. Yeah.
One last thing, I wish, Mauricio, you would go back to the CNBV and again became the vice president, because, I mean, You would certainly help us a lot more on that side. Thank you.
I guess I want to put a question in order to clarify some misconceptions that some of our audience might have, especially in a country like Mexico, where hedge funds have not been developed. People have the idea of these hedge funds as something kind of a movie character where investors can invest and get a lot of money, a high profit, etc. And like they were open to everybody, given the fact that hedge funds are open only for qualified investors. What is the situation for Mexico, for Latin America, about qualified investors? How easy is it going to be for somebody to invest in a hedge fund?
Well, the definition of a qualified investor is the one that earns, they think, 100,000 a year ODs, or they have an investment portfolio of 1.5 million UDIs, which is around
6 million pesos.
6 million pesos. So it's not really a large amount.
It's not a huge threshold. I agree.
Probably it's half or less of the threshold of an accredited investor in the US. This is a very small threshold.
Okay, but definitely this is not open for retail investors.
Not for the large retail base, but I would tell you that most clients that have opened an account in a broker dealer in Mexico, the average, I think, is qualified.
I think it depends on the advisor, because the definition of sophisticated client is related to the assets under management. And when you get to know your client, you say, okay, you have the money, but you don't have the knowledge to be exposed to some kind of asset classes.
Right.
Perfect. Well, we thank Lucy, Silvia, Carlos, Mauricio, under the skillful guidance of Laura, for this panel discussion that we hope gives us some ideas of things to come. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Thank you. Yeah.